Welcome to Excel and Business Math video number 34. Hey, in this video, we got to see the amazing function median for calculating FICA, Social Security, and Medicare payroll deductions. Now, our topics, we're definitely going to have to talk about what is the FICA payroll, Social Security, and Medicare tax deductions. Talk about calculating both of those deductions and net pay longhand. Then we'll learn how to make a tax calculation when there's a hurdle. And what a hurdle means is that below some amount, the tax rate is one number, and above some amount, the tax rate is a different hurdle. And then we'll see how to use the median function to deal with tax hurdles. And what that means is that we will be able to replace this long if, and notice that's a double if, to calculate the correct amount of taxes to use for our calculation. We'll replace this with a much simpler median function solution. And then the last example, we'll have a payroll employee table example where we do our payroll tax deductions on a bunch of employees. Now we want to start off by going over to the sheet Social Security. Now, FICA, that means Federal Insurance Contributions Act. We need to talk about FICA taxes. These are deductions from the employee's paycheck. Now, we have two different FICA taxes, Social Security and Medicare. Now, both Social Security and Medicare are federal taxes levied on the employees and the employers. Now, our calculation will be just the amount deducted from the employee paycheck. But if we deduct $10 for Social Security tax from the employee's paycheck, the employer has to match it. Not only that, the employer has to track it, the $10 here, and the amount that they match, and they're responsible to send it to the federal government. So that means when $10 is deducted, $20 actually shows up in your account. Now, the proceeds for Social Security go for pension payments after a worker has reached 62 years or later, and for disability benefits for disabled workers and dependents. Now, Social Security tax, the rate, 6.2%. But if you're lucky enough to make $130,500 or more for the year, anything above that hurdle is not taxed. That means we have a hurdle for this tax. Everything below and equal to $130,500 has one tax rate. That's 6.2%. Everything above this has a second tax rate. That's 0. Now, Medicare taxes. The proceeds are used for medical insurance for eligible elderly and disabled people. Now, for Medicare, look at this. The hurdle is $200,000. Everything equal to or less gets taxed at 1.45%. But if you're one of the few that are lucky enough to make more than $200,000, the tax rate changes once you jump over this hurdle to 2.35%. So whenever we're making our calculations for Social Security, we either use 6.2% or 0. For Medicare, there's the hurdle. Below or equal to, it's that tax rate. Above, it's the second tax rate. Now, most of us in the United States do not reach these hurdles. But since we're learning the math and the Excel solution for how to calculate these taxes, we're definitely going to have to make calculations when we have gross pay below the hurdle, exactly at the moment when we jump over the hurdle, and then when we're way above the hurdle. Now, these two taxes, remember, are levied on the employees and the employers. That means if you're self-employed, you're both the employee and the employer. So when you are self-employed, you must pay both employees and employers' taxes. All right, let's go over to our first example. I'm going to click on the sheet SS1. All right, so our first employee is Sue Radcoolinator. This is for the paycheck on Friday, November 24th, 2017. I've already listed Social Security hurdle, the first tax rate that will be used for everything up to and including that amount, and then the tax rate for above. Right here, this is the cumulative gross pay for year to date. That means up to this point before the current paycheck of $1,000, that's the amount of cumulative gross pay. So we're first going to have to compare that to this to see if they're over the hurdle before we even start our calculations. Then we'll have to compare what the cumulative total for gross pay is after this paycheck and then move forward through our calculations. So the first thing we want to calculate is the employee over the Social Security hurdle before this week's pay? Well, we, of course, can do an Excel logical formula equals are the cumulative gross pay to date greater than, without an equal sign, the hurdle. And when I hit enter, we can tell that's false. We can do that one by ourselves by eyeing it. But the formula will always get it right. Now we need to add start cumulative plus this paycheck right here. Cumulative gross pay after this week's pay, Alt equals to invoke the sum function. Those two cells are correct, and enter. Now we can create our second logical formula. We need to ask the question, is the employee over the Social Security hurdle after this week's pay? Equals, are the cumulative after this week greater than the hurdle? We can probably eye that one too, but when I hit enter, Excel agrees with us. Both false. So that means before we can actually calculate the deduction, we have to figure out how much of this week's gross pay is taxed for Social Security. Now, this one is obvious because we know it's the whole amount. But in our next example, we'll see that when you jump over the hurdle, it's not all of the earnings, it's just part of it. So we have this separate line, this separate calculation that asks the question, how much of this week's gross pay is taxable? So you ready? Equals, it's just the whole amount. Enter. Now we can finally calculate the Social Security tax deduction. And guess what? We're going to multiply gross pay times the tax rate, and there are extraneous decimals. We are required to round because it's money, and we're going to use this tax deduction amount in a subsequent formula. So, of course, all three requirements for round are met. Round, up arrow, that's the gross pay, times, and I'm going to go get the first tax rate, 6.2%, comma, 2, because we're rounding to the penny. That tells round, please round to the penny. And there it is, $62. So we're done for Social Security. Now we move on to Medicare. There's the hurdle, tax rate 1, tax rate 2. We have to do the same two logical calculations. Is employee over Medicare hurdle before this week's pay? Equals, I need to ask the question, 129,000, are you greater than the new hurdle for Medicare? Well, of course, that's going to come out false. Now, we already calculated the gross pay after, so there it is. Is 130,000 greater than the hurdle? We get a false. So that means how much of weekly gross pay is taxed at 1.45%? It's the whole amount. So there it is. Enter. Oops, I already left the 0. We'll pretend that's not there. How much is taxed for the second tax rate? Well, 0. That calculation will become important when we jump over the hurdle and when we're above the hurdle. Now we can calculate not Social Security, but Medicare. So there it is, Medicare tax deduction. I had the wrong label there. Guess what? We're still dealing with money. We still have extraneous decimals, and we're going to use this calculation in a subsequent calculation, so we have to use round. $1,000 times, there's the first tax rate, comma 2, close parentheses, and enter. Now, all of those calculations, and finally we can get to net pay after deductions, equals, there's the total gross for the week, minus, there's the first tax, minus, there's the second tax. When I hit enter, That's the net pay after those two FICA tax deductions. Now, there are other deductions that one might take out of a check too, but for this example, we have only those two deductions. All right, so this was an example where cumulative gross pay before and after the current paycheck were both below the limit. Now we want to go over to Social Security example number 2. All right, we have the same employee, Sue Radkulinator. This is 1 week later. We have our hurdle, our two tax rates, the hurdle and the two tax rates. Now, our first calculation is the employee over Social Security hurdle before this week's pay? So cell B10 equals, well, here's the gross pay cumulative before. Are you greater than the hurdle? That looks like a false. Now we need to add 130,000 plus this week's gross pay. Alt equals and enter. Now I have to ask my second question. Is employee over Social Security hurdle after this week's paycheck? Equals, well, there's the cumulative total after this week's paycheck. Are you greater than the hurdle? And when I hit enter, true. This is the one time in the year where you have to make a special calculation. How much of the week's gross pay is taxed for Social Security? For Social Security, well, it's not all of it. And we have to figure out how much. Now, I like to draw a diagram when I'm learning this for the first time. Here's a certain height, a second height, and a third height. We're going to have 3 different numbers. And first, I want to look at cumulative gross pay year to date before this paycheck. So there it is. It was 130,000 and enter. The next thing is Social Security hurdle. Remember, we jumped over this hurdle during this paycheck. Equals, there's the 130,500 and enter. And finally, we get cumulative gross pay after this week's paycheck equals, there it is, 131,000 and enter. So we can clearly see we went from 130,000 to 131. So if I use the entire paycheck, which is $1,000, that would be too much of the paycheck times the first tax rate. So the trick is to visually see, well, if we just jumped over the hurdle during this period, if I take the hurdle and subtract what the cumulative was before this paycheck, that will give me the difference, which is exactly the amount we need to multiply by 6.2. You can look at it visually, right? I had to go from this block to this block, right? And so I had to fill it up. But once I got right to there, I have to stop. So that's why we take Social Security hurdle minus begin cumulative. So right here, I'm going to make that calculation equals, there's the total hurdle minus the amount cumulative before this paycheck. And when I hit enter, 500. Now, I picked easy numbers so we could verify in our head that it was $500 from begin cumulative to that hurdle. All right, now we can calculate the Social Security tax deduction equals round tab. There's the amount taxed times the first tax rate, comma, 2, close parentheses, and enter. So we got $31. That's the Social Security tax deduction. So now on to the Medicare hurdle. There it is. First question is employee over Medicare hurdle before this week's pay equals, well, I look at the cumulative before this week's pay. Are you greater than 200,000? I don't think so. So that should come out false. How about after? Equals, well, here's the amount after. Are you greater than the hurdle? When I hit enter, there's a double false. So guess what? We're still only using 1.45 times the full amount. For how much should be taxed equals the full amount. And enter. How much for the second tax rate? 0. Now we can calculate our Medicare tax deduction equals round. I'm going to get the amount that's taxable times the correct first tax rate, comma, 2, close parentheses, and enter. So $1,450. All right, net pay, we take this week's gross pay minus there is the Social Security tax deduction minus Medicare tax deduction, and enter. That's the net pay. All right, so this example, we very clearly saw the example where we jump over the hurdle, and that means when adding the current gross pay to the cumulative at the start, and we jump over the hurdle, we have to make a special calculation on just part of the gross pay at that first tax rate. Now, for Medicare, after we jump over the hurdle, the tax rate is 0, so we don't have anything to worry about. But as we'll see in a couple examples ahead, when we get to Medicare, we have two distinct tax rates. All right, so example number 1, we are under the hurdle. Example number 2, we jumped over one of the hurdles. Now let's go look at example number 3. Now here's the situation. This is Sue. This is 2 weeks ahead, so it's December 8th. Here's our hurdles for both of the taxes. And the cumulative gross pay for year to date. That's before this paycheck. So I can come straight to the question. Is employee over Social Security hurdle before this week's pay? Equals, I'm asking the question, begin cumulative, are you greater than the hurdle? And when I hit enter, the answer is true. That means I don't even have to worry about after because I'm already above. I don't have any gross pay for this period that is taxable, and the Social Security tax deduction, we love this, it is 0. So when we're over the hurdle, it simplifies things for the Social Security tax. We're definitely selecting the second one. We're not even going to make the calculations. We're just putting 0 zeros. Now for Sue, December 8th, we still have to worry about Medicare hurdle. If I alt equals, we can clearly see that's 132. Both, I've already made the calculation, are below the limit. So for the tax amount at 1.45% equals the full amount. That means our tax is going to be, please round, the full amount times the 1.45, comma, 2 close parentheses, and enter. Equals, there's the gross pay minus Medicare tax deduction, and that's net pay after deductions. So that means when we are doing Social Security tax calculations, we can have one of 3 situations. Back in situation 1, we were under the limit, and so the entire gross pay was taxed. Situation 2, this is when you jump over the hurdle. So not all of our gross pay for this paycheck was taxed, just part of it. And then situation 3, we were already over the hurdle before we even got to this paycheck, so we get 0. So that means 3 situations. And that complicates the calculating part of this. So I would like to figure out a simple formula that would allow us to deal with all 3 situations, no matter what numbers we have. So I want to go over to the sheet 3 situations and look at the 3 situations and think about the 3 different formulas or formula input of 0 we need to put into the formula. All right, so $129,000. We have a $1,000 paycheck. So after this paycheck, we're still under the hurdle. In that case, situation 1, under the hurdle after this week. Here are the taxable earnings. So equals $1,000. Situation 2, and I'm going to change this number, $130,000. I add 1,000, so that means during this period, we jumped over the hurdle. Situation 2, we jump over the hurdle this week. Here are the taxable earnings. So it's a different formula we have to use. We have to take whatever the Social Security hurdle is minus where we started, cumulative gross pay before this paycheck, and enter. So 500. The third situation, if we start right off the bat above the hurdle, situation 3, over the hurdle before this week even started. Here's the taxable earnings, 0. That means we have 1, 2, 3 different formulas that we can potentially use to multiply times our correct tax rate. Now, we could use the if function, and in fact, most Excel spreadsheets that do payroll calculations, that's what they do. But if we slow down a minute and look at the relationship between these three numbers in all three situations, we're going to recognize a pattern that can help us create a much shorter Excel formula. All right, I'm going to change this back to 129,000. Now look at these numbers. Situation 1, 1,000. Well, these two numbers we wouldn't use, but just look at the pattern. If we were to sort these numbers from smallest to biggest, which one is in the middle? 1,000 is in the middle. 1,000 is in between 0 and 1,500. All right, let's try situation 2, 130,000. There's our three numbers. If I were to sort them from smallest to biggest, the one in the middle is 500. And that's the one that we would need to multiply by the tax rate. Now let's start off above the hurdle. There's our three numbers. If we were to sort them from the smallest number, minus 500, to the biggest one, the one in the middle is 0. So we have two formulas, equal the full amount or minus Social Security hurdle minus cumulative before, or 0. Those are the three things. If somehow we could automatically pick between these three things and always pick the one in the middle, that would be our formula. Now, the answer to this riddle is the median function. So I want to go over to the sheet median. And we want to talk about the median function. The median function will always pick the number that is in the middle of a sorted list. Now, manually, we could do this, right? I'm looking at this sorted list, sorted smallest to biggest. So the one in the middle is 1,000. Over here, this sorted list, 500 is in the middle. This sorted list, smallest to biggest, 0 is in the middle. Now, we looked at a sorted list, so it was easy for us to pick the one in the middle. But, and I shouldn't have any of these formulas down here, the median function doesn't care if it's a sorted list or not. It'll just look at whatever set of numbers you give it, and internally, it will sort and always pick the one in the middle. So let's look at the median function. And in fact, let's read the screen tip here. Returns the median, or the number in the middle of a set of given numbers. That is amazing. I can't believe there's a function that does exactly what we want. I highlight. These are not sorted. Close parentheses, Control Enter, but no problem. It picked out the one in the middle. Now, those are relative cell references, so when I Control C and paste, got the one in the middle. Paste, it got the one in the middle. Now, if you do it on a larger set, which we're not going to do, but I'll just show you, this is an odd number, and this is an even number. So how does median calculate the one in the middle? Well, of course, this one is already sorted, just so we can visually see that it's 8. Median. If we were doing this manually, we'd have to go, hey, 3 smallest, 3 biggest, there's the one in the middle. But watch what median does when there's an even set of numbers. It will internally exclude the 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom. It will take the 2 middle ones and calculate the average. Add them up, divide by the count. Now, again, for us, we're just going to use the median for this awesome payroll calculation where we have these 3 different numbers. The median function and calculation is done in statistics and is very common in real estate. Picking the one in the middle. All right, let's go over to 3 situations. And here's the moment of truth. Which is in the middle? If we have a formula, which of course we do with median, this will always be the correct amount to multiply by the tax rate for under the hurdle. So you ready? Equals median. Now, just like other aggregate functions, sum, average, and so on, we can actually put in as many different numbers. And internally, it will take all the numbers, sort them, and pick the one in the middle. I'm going to put a 0. That's a hard-coded number, comma. The first option, the second number, that's going to be gross pay, comma. And the third possibility is our formula. Whatever the hurdle is for this tax rate minus what the cumulative was before this paycheck. Close parentheses. Control Enter. And look at that. It got it right. 0 when the start cumulative is over the hurdle. If I change this to 129, it better give me 1,000. And sure enough, it does. If I change this to exactly 130 and enter, that is amazing. Now, the median, that actually is what we're going to use for this FICA tax deduction. But anytime you have a hurdle that determines one of two rates, whether for Social Security, Medicare, or things like commission rates, anytime there's a hurdle, you can use this median trick to pick between the 3 different items. Now let's go over to the sheet SS4. And here's Sue. And wow, Sue had 199,500 total gross pay before this paycheck. Wow, I wish I could make that much. Well, I'm going to calculate the cumulative amount after this paycheck. Alt equals and enter. So we can skip over the true and false things and go straight to how much of week's gross pay is taxed for Social Security. We use our median equals the median. I'm going to put 0. It doesn't matter which order you put them in, comma, the actual full amount, gross pay for this pay period, or whatever the hurdle is minus cumulative before this paycheck. Close parentheses, and it better give me a 0. That means, and we'll test it. We'll change that in just a moment. That means when we round 0 times the first tax rate, comma, 2, close parentheses, that will work. Now, for Social Security, we don't have to worry about the second tax rate because it's 0. Down here, we'll see how to slightly amend this calculation. But for us now, this will work. I'm going to put 129,000. And sure enough, the formula median got exactly the correct total gross pay and calculated the tax amount. If we jump over the hurdle, it got it right. And if we go back to 199,500, we get zeros all the way around. Now let's do this for Medicare. There's the hurdle of 200,000. There's the tax rate before, after the hurdle. Now I'm going to skip over 1, 2, 3. We don't need to do any of these calculations. Those are true, false calculations. I'm just going to skip straight to how much of week's gross pay is taxed at 1.45%. Now the parallel is this. That's the tax rate for under the hurdle. That was the tax rate for under the hurdle. So the way we calculate the amount for tax rate under the hurdle is median. So we can do that here. Equals the median. Doesn't matter which order. I'm going to put it in a different order just to show to you. There's the full gross pay for this pay period, comma, or 0, comma, or whatever the hurdle is, minus cumulative before this paycheck. Doesn't matter which order. It will always calculate it correctly. And look at that. Median totally got it right because we went from 199,500 to 200,500. So that's the correct amount. Now the trick is, since we have 2 tax rates, how much of week's gross pay is taxed at the other rate? Because we actually have to take these 2 amounts times each one of these tax rates. Well, that's no problem. We simply take the total gross pay for this paycheck minus our median calculation. And that will work every single time. Now, we have to take taxable amount under the hurdle times the first rate, taxable amount over the hurdle times the second tax rate, and then add them. Now, we could do that in individual steps, but because I'm going to add and then use that sum times the tax rate, I'm going to use the sum function. So Alt equals, it guesses totally wrong, but no problem. I'm going to click on the amount taxed times at the lower tax rate, and then I'm going to type a comma, amount taxed over the hurdle times that tax rate. Now, we're not quite done, but that is the correct amount, 19 bucks. 500 times 1.45 plus 500 times 2.35. Now, we definitely run the risk of a rounding error because we're required to round for money. We have extraneous decimals, and we're going to be using the calculation in a subsequent formula. So I'm going to wrap the round function around that. Come to the end, comma 2, close parentheses, and Control Enter. And now we can finally calculate net pay. There is the gross minus. And I'm going to click on the cell with the Social Security tax deduction, even though it's 0, because we want our solution to work in all situations, minus this tax, and Enter. Now, that solution right there, no matter what we type in, will give us the correct 2 tax deductions and the net pay. So I'm going to change this to $129,000. And when I hit Enter, it got the correct amounts here and for Medicare. $130,000. Ooh, it got the correct taxable amount and tax deduction there, and the correct amount down here. 1,000, 0, and then the total tax. If I change it to $199,500, well, these are all zeros, but here it split it apart and calculated the correct deduction. If I go ahead and type exactly 200,000, it got it right. 0 at the 1.5%. 1,000 at the 2.35%, and there's $2,350 and the correct net pay. Now we want to take what we learned here and try it on a full data set. So we're going to go over to SS5. I put in an assumption table at the top, the hurdle, the 2 tax rates, the hurdle, the 2 tax rates. You actually don't need this tax rate at all here. I emphasize that there's 2, even though this one was 0, just so we had a parallel example when we got to this one. Cumulative gross after this paycheck, no problem. Alt equals, it got that right, Control Enter, and I can copy that down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Now Social Security deduction. Well, I'm going to start with just the median and try and calculate the amount of gross pay that we multiply times 6.2. So equals median. We can do it in any order. Well, I know there's a 0, comma. I know there's the full amount, comma. And I know whatever the hurdle is up here. And I need to lock that with the F4 key. Minus the cumulative before this paycheck. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and copy it down. I'm going to go to the last cell and hit F2. All right, so that looks like it's calculating correctly. I need to take that taxable amount, and this one's easier than the Medicare. We just take the full amount, whatever it is, and multiply it by the 6.2%. So F2 times 6.2%. And I need to lock that with the F4 key. Now, before I even enter this, all 3 conditions for round are met. So I come up here and use the round function, comma 2, close parentheses. Now, inside of number, we have the median. That's just picking out the right taxable amount times the tax rate. And then we round it. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. We want to verify that the relative cell references are working and absolute cell reference for the hurdle and for the tax rate. Looking good. By the way, I didn't even show you the much longer if formula. If we go back over to SS4 off to the side here, that's a much longer, more complicated because you have to work through multiple logical tests using the if function. So I'm glad we have F2, the median. All right, now Medicare. Now we could build a huge, long formula, but sometimes when you have a solution like this, you can come off to the side and use 2 helper columns and then refer to those in our final deduction calculation. So I'm going to create taxable amount for the 1.45% and then taxable amount for the 2.35%. How do we do that? This is the amount of taxable earnings for when we're below the hurdle. Well, we know when we have that situation, we can use the median function. It's going to be 0, comma, or it's going to be the full gross pay for this week, comma, or it's going to be the correct hurdle. In our case, Medicare. The hurdle needs to be locked, so I hit the F4 key. I subtract from that hurdle whatever the begin cumulative was. That's a relative cell reference. So now I close parentheses, Control Enter, and copy it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. I'm verifying that all the cell references are pointing to the correct location. All right, Enter. Taxable for above the hurdle, well, we simply take whatever gross pay is for the week as a relative cell reference minus whatever amount was going to be taxed for the lower tax rate. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Now, we could actually copy and paste these into our formula, but forget that. I'm just going to make a straight formula here that refers to these columns outside our calculations. Now, I have two taxable amounts that I need to multiply by two rates. So inside the sum function, Alt equals, I'm going to get the first taxable amount for below the hurdle as a relative cell reference times there's the correct tax rate. I got to lock it using the F4 key. So as I copy down, it's locked. Comma. Second taxable amount when we're above the hurdle as a relative cell reference times there's the tax rate for above the hurdle. And I got to F4 to lock it. That will give me the amount, but I have to round because all three conditions are met for rounding. After the equal sign, I type round very carefully at the end with my I-beam cursor. I click, comma, 2 to round to the penny, close parentheses. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. I'm checking to see if all of the cell references, these relative and these absolute cell references are working, and yes, they are. Now, total deductions. Alt equals, it guessed right. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Now we have net pay equals the gross minus the total of the deductions. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Notice this time we actually didn't do minus of two deductions because on those other sheets, the actual two deductions were far apart. So we couldn't really use, or we chose not to use the sum function. But when they were right next to each other, it's convenient to add the total deductions first, especially when you have other calculations like we will do next video when we have income tax. All right, so that was a lot of fun with Social Security. Now, there are a bunch of homework problems for you to practice. And in this video, we saw a complete payroll table where we calculated cumulative after the paycheck, Social Security tax using the median, Medicare, where we calculated based on a helper column where we did our median calculation, total deductions, and net pay. We also, very importantly, talked about the three different situations when you're dealing with a hurdle and some rate. Our rate was a tax rate, but this solution using median can easily be used for commission rates also. We talked a little bit about the median function, and we talked about three situations, either above the hurdle, jumping over the hurdle, or below the hurdle. All right, if you like that video, be sure to click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and sub, because there's always lots more videos to come from Excel is Fun, including next video, we'll talk about VLOOKUP and federal income tax deduction. All right, we'll see you next video.